Inside the courtroom, my son pushed the papers toward me. Sign them. You give up all rights to see your grandson. My daughter-in-law smirked. After today, you're just a lonely old man. I said nothing. Instead, I took a sealed government envelope from my briefcase and handed it to the judge. He read the first page, then slowly stood up. My son's face went pale. My daughter-in-law froze. They had no idea my next move would destroy both of their careers. This story includes fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or locations is coincidental, but the core lesson remains deeply useful. Most of my life, I've gone unnoticed. That wasn't an accident. It was a choice. My name is Harlan Mercer. 69 years old. I live by myself in a place most folks would size up as plain tan brick, a shallow front stoop, and out back a weathered oak bench my wife Lorraine picked out 30 years ago because she said it put her in mind of the parks she knew as a girl. Lorraine's been gone 4 years now. The bench is still there. Truth is, nothing in this house has changed because touching any of it felt like losing the argument. And in 41 years of marriage, I never once got the better of Lorraine. Didn't seem right to start trying after she left. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along, because there are more where this came from. While you're settling in, drop a note in the comments and let me know what you're up to. Right now, are you driving somewhere, cooking dinner, or just resting at the end of a long day? I'd genuinely like to know. A quick word before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped for audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real persons or events is coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the center of it. Around the neighborhood, the story on me is simple retired government clerk, a man who pushes paper, reads a printed newspaper because he never made his peace with the internet rolls around in a 2007 Chevy Impala that needs a new muffler, and minds his own business the way older men do once the world's pace has outrun their interest in keeping up. The quiet part, they've got that right. Everything else, I'll come back to. Owen showed up every Saturday morning without fail. 10 years old. He had his mother's dark eyes and a laugh that lived somewhere deeper in him than it does in most children his age, the kind that convinced you your joke had actually landed, not just made noise. He'd been making those Saturday visits since he was barely walking back in the days when his parents still had use for a grandfather. Back before, Caden decided that word useful no longer applied. That particular Saturday fell in March, one of those mornings, caught between seasons, not quite done with winter, not yet committed to spring. I was out back when the gate latch lifted and Owen came through. He was in the wheelchair, 7 months in that chair by then. Leukemia, Caden had said it was a rare form. The medical team was working to manage it, though, slowly. Serena, my daughter-in-law, who headed a children's charity called the Light for Our Children Foundation, and possessed a rare talent for turning any room into a staged event, had been keeping her followers current with regular online posts. The response was enormous. People donated in big numbers. The totals on the charity page kept going up. Owen wheeled himself over to where I stood near the bench and tilted those dark eyes up at me. "Hey, Grandpa." "Hey, buddy." I dragged the old wooden chair alongside his and settled in so we were face to face. "You get any breakfast?" "Mom made oatmeal." He scrunched his nose. "With the walnuts." "The crime of the century." A near smile crossed his face. Nearly, but it stopped short. It didn't climb all the way to his eyes the way it once had. I filed that away the way I file most things. No expression, no comment, just noted. My phone went off in my shirt pocket. Before I even pulled it out, I knew. Caden. Dad. That tone, the one he saved for clients he had little regard for but couldn't afford to alienate. Measured, courteous enough to pass. Don't let him run around. He had a rough night. "We're in the garden, Caden. We're sitting down." "I know, but the last time you gave him too much freedom to move, he paid for it over 3 days. I glanced at Owen. He was fixed on a blue jay perched on the fence with the studied concentration of a boy, pretending a conversation isn't happening when he can hear every word. "He's in the chair," I said. "I'll see to it he takes it easy." "Good." Then a beat of silence, the kind that's clearing space for the real ask. "Also, Dad Serena's got a gala next Friday. Major donors coming. Having family there would mean something. Help put a face to all of it." I had attended 2 of Serena's events before, stood near the back of rooms perfumed with wealth and good intentions, watching people uncap their checkbooks with the glow of true believers. I'd smiled through it, pressed a lot of hands, never said a word that stuck. Let me think on it, I said. Great. The line went dead. No parting word, just the sound of a man crossing one task off and moving to the next. I put the phone down on the armrest screen, side down, and turned my attention back to Owen. Your father calls a lot, I said. Owen ran a finger along the edge of the armrest. He worries. Oh, that's so. Owen raised his eyes. Something shifted across his face for just a moment. Not sorrow exactly, more the look of a person standing at a door weighing whether to open it. Then he turned back toward the fence. He worries about a lot of things, he said. We stayed like that, the two of us. The bird song, the faint groan of a lawnmower working somewhere 2 blocks away, and the particular Saturday morning stillness that a backyard holds when everything still seems fine. I watched Owen the way decades of training had taught me to watch, not with any obvious attention. No staring, just a steady, quiet presence taking things in. The set of his shoulders, the way his hands lay in his lap, how he carried his weight in that chair. I had spent years working with children, not as a grandfather or a neighbor, not in any of the ordinary roles. In a professional capacity that I'd never disclosed to Caden, never raised with Serena, never spoken of outside a very particular set of offices inside a building that most people passed on the street without a glance. Observing children reading them had been my occupation for a long time, a very long time. And watching Owen track that blue jay across the fence, I observed something. His left foot, moving, not the restless jerk of an anxious child, just a quiet, even rhythm, the automatic motion of a foot that's forgotten. It was meant to stay still. The motion of a body entirely at ease. In 7 months of watching Owen in that wheelchair, I'd seen him transferred carefully in and out of vehicles. I'd seen him wince when a movement came too fast. Seen his hands go tight on the armrests whenever the ground turned uneven beneath him. Seen him accept an offered arm just to clear a single step. That left foot was tapping like none of those 7 months had ever taken place. I let it go without a word. I reached for the pitcher on the side table, filled a glass, and held it out to him. Want to hear about the time your grandmother decided to grow tomatoes out here? Ended up with what she called a harvest, and I called the world's saddest fruit. Owen took the glass. You've told me that story. I tell it better every time. He smiled, then the real kind, the kind that went all the way up. I settled back and let the story come, keeping my voice loose and warm and entirely unremarkable. And underneath all of it, turning quietly in the back of my mind, like something rolled between 2 fingers what I had just seen. The way you turn a stone over to find out what's been hiding beneath it. That foot had been moving for 6 minutes. 30 years I had spent developing an eye for the things other people walk right past. And on that quiet Saturday morning in my garden, I had just seen something about my grandson that I wasn't prepared to name yet. Close to an hour went by, maybe longer. The kind of time that wears an ordinary face until suddenly it doesn't. I told Owen I was heading in to top off the water pitcher. That was the reason I gave him. What I did instead was halt just inside the back door, where the kitchen window gives you a sidelong view of the yard, the bench, the gate, and the corner where Lorraine used to tend her herb garden until the deer made it their own. I stood with the empty pitcher and watched. Owen remained in the wheelchair for roughly 40 seconds after the door closed behind me. His head moved left then right, taking inventory. The blue jay had gone. The yard held nothing but silence and a strip of bare earth along the fence where the winter had scraped the grass away and nothing had grown back. Then he got up. No hesitation, no caution. None of the deliberate effort a child with fragile bones and 7 months of illness brings to getting on his feet. He simply rose the way a healthy 10-year-old rises when no one is there to see it. No ceremony, no thought given to it at all. He crossed to the far corner, maybe 15 feet, crouched down and retrieved a rubber ball that had rolled under the hydrangea sometime last fall, turned it over in his hands and jogged back toward the chair. Actually jogged that loose, unthinking stride that belongs to a kid who has never had cause to doubt his own legs. My grip on the pitcher went tight. He was 3 feet from the wheelchair when he looked up and found me at the kitchen window. He froze. That look, I recognized it, not from playgrounds or classrooms or family living rooms. I'd seen it on children who had been caught doing something they'd been warned with great deliberateness never to do in front of certain people. 1 part, fear; 2 parts, something older and heavier. The specific exhaustion that settles into a child who has been guarding a secret long enough that the secret has taken on a life of its own. I pushed through the back door, crossed the yard, and took my seat on the bench. Owen climbed back into the wheelchair. His hands gripped the armrests, trembling faintly, and his face had drained to the color of old chalk. I set the pitcher down on the table. "You knocked your cup over a minute ago," I said, nodding toward the grass beside his wheel. "Let me grab that." I bent down and retrieved the cup, which hadn't moved. I set it next to the pitcher, filled it, and passed it back to him. Owen took it in both hands and stared into it like the water might offer him something useful. "Grandpa," he started. "You don't owe me any explanation," I said. My voice stayed the way I kept most things level, unhurried, nothing with an edge. "You don't have to say anything at all." He gave a small nod, took a sip. The trembling in his hands eased a little. We stayed there without talking for a stretch. The lawnmower 2 streets over had gone silent. A dog on the next block barked once and let it go. The sky had turned that pale, non-committal white that belongs to days that never fully decide to be sunny. Then Owen spoke so quietly, I nearly missed it. "Grandpa?" "Yeah." His gaze was somewhere else, fixed on the hydrangea in the corner, on the spot where the rubber ball had been lying. "How much longer do I have to be sick?" The question hit like something heavy falling. 7 words. A 10-year-old boy not asking his father, not asking his mother, asking me in a backyard in Ohio on a Saturday morning in March, with that pale sky stretched flat above him and a cup of water trembling in his grip. I drew a slow breath in through my nose, deliberate, and controlled the way I'd trained myself to breathe in rooms where a poorly timed reaction could unravel everything. "What's got you thinking about that, buddy?" I said. He hitched one shoulder in a shrug, working hard to look offhand. "Just wondering. You feeling all right today?" "I feel fine," said too fast. He caught it himself and walked it back. "I mean, okay." "Okay," I said. He finally looked at me. Those dark eyes carried the gravity children's eyes acquire when an adult has placed something inside them and never returned to collect it. My chest ached with a particular kind of pain that has no proper name. The pain of seeing something clearly that you would give anything to have misread. "I'm glad you came today," I told him. I meant it with every year I had in me. The corner of his mouth shifted. Not a smile exactly, something more guarded than that. "Me too, Grandpa." A car turned onto the street. I heard it slow. Heard the sound of Caden's tires on my gravel drive, then the engine shutting off with the heavy clunk of a vehicle worth more than this house. Owen straightened in the wheelchair. His hands settled into his lap, folded and still. The shift was so smooth, so thoroughly rehearsed, that it struck me somewhere beneath the ribs, a child who had practiced through repetition, the precise art of becoming sick again the moment it was required. The gate swung open. Caden stepped through, still in his work clothes at 11 on a Saturday morning. Navy slacks, a pressed shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. The wardrobe of a man whose clothing communicates nothing except competence and cost. He was 39, with the jaw of someone who had always gotten his way and moved through every room as though the furniture had been positioned ahead of his arrival. His eyes went to Owen first. "You doing okay, bud?" "Yeah, Dad." Owen's voice was different now, smaller, tamped down. "I'm tired." Caden nodded with the rehearsed attentiveness of a man who has delivered the right words so many times they've stopped requiring thought. Then his gaze shifted to me. "Thanks for having him, Dad. He's got afternoon therapy at 2. "Of course," I said. I stood and placed my hand briefly on Owen's shoulder, just a moment, just enough to feel him press into it, the smallest lean, the way a plant angles itself toward the one window available. "Same time next week?" I asked him. "Yeah," he looked up at me. "Same time." Caden was already guiding the wheelchair through the gate phone to his ear, his voice settling into the smooth, commanding register he used when he needed something from someone. I stood at the gate and watched the car roll back down the driveway, watched until the taillights vanished around the corner. Then I walked back to the bench and sat and looked at the corner of the yard where the rubber ball was still sitting in the mud near the hydrangea, right where a healthy 10-year-old boy had left it. I let Caden take him without a word. Not for lack of things to say, but because I'd learned long before, that morning, that the most dangerous moment to speak is the one just before you're certain. I didn't sleep that night. Not 1 hour. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that cooled untouched, and I did something I hadn't done in 4 years. I began thinking like the man I was before I decided that man had earned his retirement. I went back over the past 6 months. Not the headline moments, not the hospital visits, the fundraising events, the calls from Caden, laying out the latest treatment protocol in the clipped, efficient tone of a man walking through a quarterly report. I thought about the small things, the details I'd stored away without intending to, the way the mind retains things when observation isn't a habit, it's a structure. The fact that Owen consistently looked worse on Monday mornings and noticeably better by Friday afternoons. The fact that over 7 months of documented illness, Serena had referenced 3 different hospitals, never the same, one twice, and never with a specific physician's name attached. The fact that Owen had twice begun to tell me something, then glanced toward the doorway and steered the conversation elsewhere so deftly that a less practiced eye would have seen nothing but a boy changing the subject. I had seen the pivot. I'd simply chosen God help me to log it under things I was probably misreading. I opened my laptop. The Light for Our Children Foundation had a website built by someone who understood the dollar value of good design. Clean lines, professional layout, a homepage photograph of smiling children, golden lit and softly focused, the kind of image that prompts a hand toward a wallet before the mind has consciously agreed. And there was Owen, my grandson. In a hospital bed, I didn't recognize an IV line taped to his arm, his face arranged in the particular expression of a child who has been coached to look courageous. Blue patient gown, his eyes aimed just slightly off camera toward something or someone outside the frame. I looked at that photograph for a long time. The donation counter read $412,000. Updated as of that morning. I scrolled down, there were videos. Serena in a soft cardigan speaking into the camera with the composed grief-adjacent expression of a woman who had rehearsed it and gotten it exactly right. Her voice broke at precisely the correct moments. She spoke about Owen's courage, his spirit, his good days and the hard ones, the way he still tried to hold on to a smile. I clicked the oldest video in the library. Owen was sitting in what appeared to be a hospital consultation room, though something in the lighting was off, the shadows falling at angles that didn't match overhead fluorescence. He looked to be around 8 years old in the footage, which meant this had been running for considerably longer than 7 months. He stared straight into the lens and spoke in a voice that was flat and careful, and bore no resemblance to the voice he used when we talked about blue jays and walnuts and oatmeal. I just want to get better so I can play with my friends again. My hand moved to the trackpad and stopped the video. I sat there looking at my grandson's face frozen on the screen and felt something move through me that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage and didn't fit cleanly into any word I owned. It was the feeling of a man who has spent 30 years constructing barriers against exactly this kind of thing, finding himself standing on the wrong side of one. I pressed play again. I watched every video in that library, all 14 of them. By the time I shut the laptop, the kitchen window had shifted from black to the particular deep blue that belongs to 4 in the morning, when the birds haven't yet found their voices, and the world is about as silent as it ever gets. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Then I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 11 years. 4 rings, then Harlan Mercer. The voice was groggy, but not rattled. The voice of a man who had accepted long ago that calls at strange hours were simply part of a certain kind of life. It's been a while. It has, I said. I need something from you, Boyd, and it has to stay between us. Dr. Boyd Whitaker, a pediatric internist I had worked alongside on a case in 2013 that neither of us brought up at social gatherings, cleared his throat. What kind of something? The kind where you look at a child and tell me what you actually see. Not what anyone has briefed you to find. Just what's there. A pause. How old? 10. Another pause. Longer. Next Tuesday works, I said. If you have room. I'll make room, he said, and that was that. I set the phone down and looked out through the kitchen window at the dark yard, the weathered oak bench, the hydrangea in the corner where a healthy 10-year-old boy had picked up a rubber ball the previous afternoon. I had been in this kind of position before, sitting alone in the small hours with something ugly assembling itself in front of me, working out how quickly to move and in what direction. When you've spent a career doing what I did, the instinct is always the same: slow down, build, solid footing before you advance. I was going to need to be very, very careful because the person I needed to outmaneuver shared my last name and had spent 39 years watching me perform smallness I didn't possess. He believed the performance. That was the advantage. I closed the laptop, rinsed my cup, and got into bed. Sleep didn't come, but I lay in the dark and assembled a list, the way I had always assembled lists, not written down, not anywhere that could be found, but in the part of my mind where things are kept until they're needed. By the time daylight came through the curtains, the list was long enough to begin. Tuesday arrived cold and gray. That particular late March cold that feels almost deliberate, as if the season had decided you personally needed one more week of it before spring bothered to appear. On Sunday, I had called Serena, my voice easy, my reason unremarkable. I'd like to bring Owen in for a general checkup, just for my own peace of mind. You know how older men get to worrying. She'd given me that bright camera-ready laugh of hers and said, of course, how thoughtful she'd let Owen know. No pause, no suspicion. Why would there be? As far as Serena and Caden were concerned, I was a retired paper pusher with a rattling car and too many empty hours. A worried grandfather. Harmless. That had always been exactly what I needed them to believe. I picked Owen up at 9. He was waiting on the front steps in his jacket, the wheelchair folded beside him. He settled into it as I pulled to the curb, moving with the automatic rehearsed motion of a child who knew precisely when the performance was required to begin. We drove 20 minutes before he said anything. Where are we going? A doctor's office, I said. Old friend of mine, just a checkup. I watched him in the rearview mirror. Something crossed his face, a flicker that might have been fear or might have been relief, or might have been both at once layered on top of each other, the way feelings stack when someone has been sitting on them too long. Mom didn't mention a new doctor, he said carefully. I called her Sunday. She said it was fine. He turned toward the window. Okay. You nervous? A beat. A little. That's fair, I said. You know what I do when I'm nervous? I think about the worst thing that could reasonably happen. And then I ask myself whether I could get through it. The answer's always yes. After that, the nerves don't have as much to work with. Owen considered that. That sounds like a lot of work. Gets faster with practice. He almost smiled. I caught it in the mirror. That near smile of his, the one that lived at the very edge of his mouth and never quite committed. Something turned over quietly inside my chest, and I kept my eyes on the road. Dr. Boyd Whitaker ran a private pediatric practice out of a 2-story brick building on the east side of Cincinnati. The sort of office that was deliberately understated on the outside, the kind of place serious people sought out precisely because it didn't announce itself. He was 62, silver-haired, with the unhurried patience of a man who had long since stopped performing busyness and simply worked. He shook Owen's hand first. I noticed Owen respond to it, his posture lifting slightly, the small adjustment of a child who had just been treated as a person and found it mildly surprising. You're welcome to wait out here, Boyd told me, gesturing toward the waiting area. Or come in, your call. I looked at Owen. You want me in there? Owen's hands went to the armrests. Yeah, he said, if that's okay. Then I'm in there, I said. The examination ran 45 minutes. Boyd worked the way he always had, methodically, quietly narrating each step, before he took it in the level, matter-of-fact tone that skilled pediatric doctors develop, because children can read condescension before it's halfway out of a person's mouth. He checked Owen's reflexes, his lymph nodes, his blood pressure, his eyes. He drew 2 vials of blood, with such practiced efficiency that Owen barely registered it. Through all of it, Owen sat on the examination table with his hands folded, answering Boyd's questions in short, measured sentences. He was performing. I could see the signs, the slight dimming of his expression, the way he considered his words before releasing them. But Boyd was experienced enough not to press, and Owen was tired enough that the edges slipped occasionally. A genuine laugh when Boyd made a dry remark about the weather. A real grimace when Boyd pressed gently on a spot along his lower back and asked if it hurt. A little, Owen said, but not like bad pain. Just regular 10-year-old back pain, Boyd said. From sitting too long, probably. Something shifted in Owen's face that I couldn't fully read. Something caught between confusion and a grief too seasoned for his age. Boyd sent Owen to the restroom with a sample cup, and the moment the door clicked shut, he turned to me. Harlan. His voice was low, precise, and entirely serious. What exactly are you expecting me to find? I'm not expecting anything, I said. I want to know what's actually there. Boyd studied me for a moment with the look of a man running quick calculations. Then he nodded and returned to his notes. When Owen came back, Boyd wrapped up the examination and sent him to the waiting room, told him there was a juice box in the small refrigerator by the front desk if he wanted one. Owen looked at me first, a quick searching look, and I gave him a small nod. He went. Boyd closed the door. He stood at his desk with the chart open before him, regarding me over the tops of his glasses, and the expression on his face was one I had seen before on people who spent their professional lives delivering hard truths. Harlan, he said, this child is perfectly healthy. Every marker is normal. Blood pressure, reflexes, lymphatic response, all of it. There is no evidence of any chronic illness. Not active, not in remission, nothing. The words settled into that small room without much noise. I had known. I had known since Saturday morning in the backyard. But there is a meaningful distance between knowing something and hearing it stated aloud by a licensed physician in a clinical setting, and my hands on my knees pressed down harder than they needed to. "Show me the medical records Serena provided," Boyd said. I handed over the folder. He opened it, read the first page, turned to the second. His jaw tightened in the manner of a man working hard to keep his face neutral. "These records," he said, "do not describe this child, not even approximately." He set the folder down and met my eyes directly, his voice dropping further. "Harlan, if someone has been giving this boy medication to make him present as ill, that is no longer a family matter. You understand what I'm telling you?" My throat tightened. I pressed my lips together and gave one sharp nod. "I need a formal report," I said. "Signed and sealed." "You'll have it by end of day," Boyd said. I thanked him. I walked out to the waiting room where Owen was sitting with the juice box, turning it over and over in his hands, not drinking it, just rotating it. "All done?" he asked. "All done," I said. On the drive back, Owen fell asleep within 10 minutes. His head tipped against the window, his breathing slow and even and entirely untroubled, the breathing of a child whose body had never once been sick. I drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Boyd's sealed report sitting on the passenger seat. And I thought about the cabinet in Caden's house, the one I had taken note of months ago and told myself was none of my concern. I had exhausted every reason to keep saying that. 2 days after I drove home with Dr. Boyd Whitaker's sealed report on my passenger seat, Caden called to invite me to dinner. He had never done that before, not once in 4 years of living 20 minutes apart. The calls I received from my son concerned logistics, Owen's schedule, holiday arrangements, the occasional summons to appear somewhere and not embarrass anyone. A dinner invitation offered in a voice that was almost warm was unusual enough to tell me something in his thinking had shifted. I said yes without hesitating. The house Caden and Serena lived in declared itself from the street. A red brick Tudor with neat black shutters and a 3-car garage, landscaping so precise it looked like someone came weekly to measure the grass. Inside, everything coordinated in the deliberate way of people who commission a decorator and then execute the instructions without deviation. I had been there a dozen times and never once felt like I was in a home. I felt like I was in a showroom. Serena met me at the door, in an apron that somehow looked designed. She kissed my cheek, brought a scent of expensive hand lotion with her, and said dinner was nearly ready. "We're so glad you came, Harlan," she said, and the smile she wore was the one she used on camera, wide, warm, pitched 1 degree past genuine. "Wouldn't miss it," I said. The dining table was set for 4. Owen was already in his seat with that pale look he carried at the start of evenings, that particular manufactured pallor I was only now recognizing for what it was. Not illness, exhaustion, the exhaustion of a 10-year-old who had been performing for too long. "Hey, Grandpa!" His face opened when he spotted me, a real smile breaking through before he caught himself and dialed it back to something quieter. "You're here. Told you I'd come," I said, and put my hand briefly on his shoulder as I settled in beside him. Caden came through from the kitchen, carrying a bottle of wine, and already pouring before he'd sat down, filling the room with the easy, practiced energy of a man who believed he was the most capable person in any room he occupied. "Good to have you, Dad," he said, handing me a glass. "We don't do this enough." "We don't," I agreed. Dinner was good. Serena could cook genuinely, not just adequately, and the food was the most honest thing at the table. That evening, Caden discussed a case at work, some corporate merger he laid out in just enough detail to establish its importance, then summarized quickly once he had decided I had probably lost the thread. I asked a few questions. I laughed in the right places. To any observer, I was exactly what I had always appeared to be. What I was actually doing was watching Serena. She moved through the meal the way she moved through everything, fluidly, efficiently, with a competence that was almost elegant if you didn't think too carefully about what it was in service of. She topped off water glasses without prompting. She steered the conversation whenever it drifted off course. And 15 minutes into dinner, in the brief gap between passing the bread and asking Caden about his week, she reached toward Owen's side of the table, picked up his glass, and tipped something into it from a small amber vial she had palmed so smoothly I nearly missed it. Nearly. The vial vanished back into her apron pocket in under 3 seconds. She set the glass back in front of Owen and said, "Drink some water, sweetheart. You look flushed." Owen picked up the glass and drank. My hand resting on my knee beneath the table slowly curled into a fist. I drew a breath in through my nose, let it out through my mouth. I picked up my fork and ate a bite of roast chicken and told Caden the merger sounded genuinely complicated. And I watched my grandson finish his water. 40 minutes later, Owen was struggling to keep his eyes open. "He fades so quickly these days," Serena said, her voice carrying exactly the right measure of quiet sorrow. "It breaks my heart." "It would break anyone's," I said. She smiled at me, grateful, trusting, and took Owen upstairs. Caden leaned back in his chair and refreshed his wine. "You see what we're living with?" he said. Not quite a question. "I do," I said. "It must be very hard." "It is." He turned the glass in his hand. "Which is why the gala matters so much. Serena gives everything to that foundation. Having family present it tells donors it's real, personal." "Of course," I said. "I'll be there." Caden regarded me with the faint, mildly surprised approval of a man whose expectations have just been exceeded by someone he didn't expect much from. "Good," he said. "That's good, Dad." He headed to the kitchen for dessert. I got up, walked down the hall to the powder room, near the guest bathroom, the one I had used on earlier visits, the one whose medicine cabinet I had noticed was stocked with considerably more than guest toiletries. I pushed the door open, stepped in and opened the cabinet. 3 prescription bottles, all labeled with Owen's name. I read each one. The first was a standard children's antihistamine, a dosage that meant nothing by itself. The second was hydroxyzine, a prescription sedative used for anxiety in children, sometimes for sleep, but only under specific medical guidance and never as something you tip into a glass of water at the dinner table. The third was a compound I didn't immediately recognize, carrying a doctor's name that Serena and Caden had never once mentioned across 7 months of medical updates. My hands were steady. They have always been steady in the moments that matter. But somewhere behind my sternum, something was pressing outward like a fist against a door. I photographed all 3 bottles, label side-facing the light, clear, sharp, legible. I closed the cabinet and walked back to the dining room and ate dessert and listened to Caden talk. When I left an hour later, I shook his hand at the door and told Serena the roast was exceptional, which it genuinely was. I drove home under a sky packed with cold stars, turning over in my mind the fact that in 30 years of this work, the cabinet I had just photographed was inside my son's house. I had passed the exit to my neighborhood before I registered that I'd missed it. I circled back. Some things take a moment to absorb, even when you already knew. The gala fell on a Friday evening, and Serena had spent the better part of a week building toward it, the way a conductor shapes a crescendo. Every element tuned, every detail placed, nothing surrendered to chance. I arrived 40 minutes before it started. Serena was in the lobby of the event space when I walked in, a converted warehouse on the north side of the city that someone had invested heavily in making appear as though it had always been elegant. String lights, round tables draped in white linen. A podium with a screen behind it, already cycling through photographs of children in hospital settings, focused, heartbreaking, perfectly composed. Owen's face came up on the screen as I came through the door. "Hi, Harlan." Serena crossed the room with her arms slightly open and the near-genuine smile she reserved for people whose presence actually helped her. "I'm so glad you came early. It means so much." "Wouldn't be anywhere else," I said. She looked polished and purposeful, in a deep navy dress, her dark hair pulled back, a small silver pin on her lapel that matched the Light for Our Children Foundation's logo. She was, I thought, not for the first time extraordinarily good at this. Had I not witnessed what I had in those preceding 2 weeks, I would have looked at her standing there and felt nothing except admiration. "I need to wrap up a couple of things with the catering crew," she said, her hand brushing my arm for a moment. "Do you mind waiting in the back office? It's quiet back there, much easier than hovering around while we're still getting everything set up." "Of course," I told her. "Take all the time you need." The back office was compact and tidy. A desk, 2 chairs, a shelving unit lined with labeled binders, a printer running its quiet hum to no one in particular. On the desk sat an open laptop, the screen glowing with the soft, idle blue of a machine that had never been told to sleep. Serena's laptop. She had left it open. No password prompt, no lock screen, just a desktop with a column of folders running down the left side. I pulled out the chair and sat down behind the desk. The door was closed. Through it, I could make out the muffled sounds of event setup voices, the scrape of chairs across a floor, someone running a microphone through the flat, institutional 1-2 of a sound check. I looked at the screen. The folders were arranged the way Serena arranged everything, neatly labeled, clearly named, with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once considered that another person might look. Event archives, donor records, press materials, financial reports. And then at the bottom of the column, raw footage do not upload. Something in my chest went very still, not racing. It has not raced in a long time, but a particular stillness, the kind that settles over a man who has just found the thing he was most afraid of finding. I clicked the folder open. 41 video files numbered in sequence, the oldest dated 14 months back. I opened the first one. The footage was handheld, slightly unsteady shot inside what appeared to be a bedroom, dressed up to suggest a medical setting. A white sheet draped over the bed. A rolling IV stand positioned in the corner, with a saline bag that I was fairly certain had never been connected to anything. The lighting had been adjusted cooler and harsher than natural, the kind of deliberate calibration that makes a healthy child look washed out. Owen was seated on the bed. He looked younger in the footage, 8, maybe 8.5. He had on a pale blue patient gown, and his hands were folded in his lap. Serena's voice came from behind the camera, and the sound of it sent something cold moving up the back of my neck. "Okay, baby, remember what we talked about. Look a little more tired. Can you do that for me?" Owen shifted on the bed. His small shoulders dropped. His chin came down just slightly. He rearranged his face with the heartbreaking mechanical precision of a child who had been taught this the way other children are taught to say please and thank you. "Good," Serena said, and her voice was warm with approval in a way that turned my stomach completely over. "Now, when I ask how you're feeling, what do you say?" "It hurts everywhere," Owen said. His voice was flat recitative, the voice of a child delivering lines he had memorized so many times they had been emptied of all meaning. "And what else?" "And I say I want to get better so I can play with my friends." "Perfect." The camera shifted slightly. "Okay, ready." Owen looked into the lens. Whatever had been in his eyes before the camera started rolling, some last private flicker of himself, went out like a light being switched off. "Ready," he said. I stopped the video. My hands were pressed flat on the desk on either side of the laptop, and it was only then that I realized I had been holding my breath for some portion of the last 3 minutes. I let it out slowly. Breathed in again. I looked at the ceiling for exactly 4 seconds, because that is how long it takes in my experience to place something unbearable into a compartment where it will not get in the way of what has to happen next. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the USB drive I had brought with me. I had brought it because I had not hoped that I would need it. I inserted it into the port on the side of the laptop and copied the entire folder, all 41 files. The transfer took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I counted every one of them. When it finished, I removed the drive, returned it to my pocket, and put the mouse back exactly where it had been before I touched it. I stood up, straightened my jacket, walked to the office door, opened it, and stepped back into the hallway where the sounds of the event had grown. More voices now, music starting up low from somewhere in the main room, the gathered warmth of 200 people who believed with everything in them that they were part of something good. I walked down the hall and through the side door into the main room and found my assigned seat at the family table, 3rd row from the front. Caden was already there checking his phone. He looked up when I sat down. "Good spot," he said. "It is," I agreed. 10 minutes later, Owen was wheeled out onto the stage. He sat under the lights in his wheelchair, small and still, and the room did what Serena had spent months conditioning it to do. It opened its heart. It opened its wallets. It believed completely and without reservation, because it had been given no cause to do otherwise. I looked at my grandson, and he did not look back at me. He was somewhere else entirely, the somewhere that children retreat to when the world outside has asked too much of them for too long. The crowd applauded for a long time. I sat with my hands in my lap and the USB drive in my jacket pocket, and I thought about 41 video files and a child who had learned to switch himself off on command. What I did not yet know was how many other children had been taught the very same thing. I spent the first week of April the way I had spent the most important weeks of my working life, at my kitchen table, in the hours when the rest of the neighborhood was asleep, pulling on one thread until it dragged something larger into the light. The USB drive was locked in the fireproof box under my bed. Dr. Boyd Whitaker's sealed report sat in a blue folder in the filing cabinet behind my desk. The photographs of the medicine bottles were backed up in 3 separate places, because I had learned 20 years ago that a single copy of anything important is the same as no copy at all. What I needed now was the money. In the United States, any organization registered as a nonprofit, what the IRS classifies as a 501c3, is required by law to file a public financial disclosure every year. It is called a Form 990, and it is available to anyone who wants to look. The government designed it that way deliberately, the theory being that organizations asking the public for charitable donations owe the public a basic accounting of where those donations actually go. Serena's foundation had filed 3 of them. I pulled up the most recent one first. On the surface, the numbers were entirely plausible. Revenue from donations, $642 over the past fiscal year. Program expenses, meaning money directly spent on the children the foundation claimed to serve, listed at $488,000. The remainder was allocated to administrative costs and fundraising. The program expenses were broken down by hospital name and treatment category. I wrote down every hospital on the list, 7 of them spread across 4 states. Then I picked up the phone and called a man named Wendell Crabtree. No connection to any attorney, just a retired hospital administrator I had worked alongside during a fraud investigation in 2010. A man who understood institutional billing better than anyone I had ever come across. Wendell was 74, sharp as broken glass, and deeply restless in retirement. Harlan Mercer, he said. When he picked up, sounding more pleased than surprised. I was starting to wonder when you'd finally call someone. I need you to run some names for me, I said. Hospital names. I want to know whether they're real, and if they are, whether they have any record of treating pediatric patients under the billing codes I'm going to give you. You going to tell me what this is about? Not yet. Wendell made a sound that meant he understood completely and intended to help regardless. Give me 48 hours, he said. He called back in 36. 3 of your 7 hospitals don't exist, he told me. His voice had shed the easy energy of a contented retired man. He sounded the way people sound when they have turned up something they wish they hadn't. 1 is a real facility, but it has no record of treating any of the patients named in the billing codes you provided. The remaining 3 are genuine hospitals with genuine records, but the amounts billed don't come anywhere close to what's reported in that 990. I pressed my hand flat against the kitchen table and held it there. How far off? The real expenditures add up to somewhere around $64. The reported figure is 488 sarcers, $428,000, 1 fiscal year, 3 years of filings carrying the same lie. That figure occupied my kitchen table the way a physical object does something you can almost smell, almost feel the edge of if you reach out. Wendell? I said this stays between us for now. Harlan. The word came back soft, weighted with the knowing of a man who had watched this kind of rot up close before and understood what it did to the person who uncovered it. Be careful. Whoever constructed this was patient. They weren't rushing. I know, I said. Thank you. I set the phone down and stayed with the numbers until I couldn't put off the next step any longer. And then I did what I had been circling toward the whole time without once naming it to myself. I went after the children's names. The foundation's website maintained a section it called its family community. Photographs, short write-ups, ongoing campaign pages for children and families the organization claimed to serve. 21 profiles were currently live. 2 more turned up on older pages that had been pulled down but not thoroughly cleaned out. 23 names in all. I did not use the laptop. I built the spreadsheet on paper, longhand the way I had worked before everything went digital, because paper cannot be remotely accessed and does not replicate itself to servers controlled by people I had never met. Name, diagnosis, fundraising total, hospital, every column filled in by hand. What I found when I laid all 23 rows side by side was a single repeating shape conditions, severe enough to move donors emotionally, but vague enough that no physician would be called to confirm them. Hospitals that either did not exist or had no involvement. Dollar totals that matched nothing in any treatment record anywhere. A portion of these families had almost certainly been brought in deliberately. Serena approaching them with an offer a cut of whatever came in a mutual understanding that the donors were wealthy enough to absorb the loss. They would have told themselves it was a gray area, that no one was really being hurt. The others had no such arrangement. They had handed their trust to a woman who said she could help their children, and that trust had been converted into income. I worked until the neighborhood went fully dark and silent. 4 in the morning. Every name checked against property records, public announcements, social media, traces, anything I could reach without leaving a record of my own. Most of the children, as far as the available evidence could tell me, were alive and not seriously ill, whatever the listed diagnoses claimed. Then I reached the final entry. Number 24 was on a slip of paper I had copied from a cached version of the website, a page that had been removed, but not before a forum user had screenshotted it and posted it publicly, asking whether anyone else had doubts about the foundation. The name was Eli Brenton. Beside it, transcribed in my own handwriting, from what had appeared beneath his photograph 8 years old: acute lymphoblastic leukemia, ongoing treatment, donations urgently needed. And underneath that, 3 words I had added when I realized the archive page still had an active donation link. I looked at those 3 words a long time. Then my pen moved again, and I wrote 4 more below them. Check the date first. I raised my eyes to the kitchen window. Outside, the sky had shifted to the deep blue that belongs to the hour just before anyone thinks of it as morning. The birds were testing a few sounds, tentative, almost accidental. I shut the folder. 3 words next to Eli Brenton's name. I read them twice before I permitted myself to absorb what they said. Then I set the pen down, settled back against the chair, and understood clearly, without room for doubt, the nature of the people I was up against. I sat there a long time after that without moving. The street outside held the silence that only exists at 5 in the morning, that particular gap when the last person has finally gone to sleep, but no one has yet decided to get up, and the whole block rests without realizing it. My kitchen had contracted somehow. The walls felt nearer than they should. The light overhead pressed down harder than it had any right to. 6 hours I had sat beneath it without once thinking to turn on something softer. The notation beside Eli Brenton's name on that archived page read, "Still accepting donations." What I had written beneath it was, "Check the date first." So I did. A forum user had cached that page on the 14th of December, 2023. The donate button had been live and clickable on that date. The campaign copy spoke of Eli in the present tense: is fighting, is responding to treatment, is grateful for your support. Eli Brenton had died on the 2nd of February, 2023. I located his obituary in the digital archive of a small-town newspaper serving a community 40 minutes south of Cincinnati. 4 paragraphs. The kind of obituary composed by people with little money and no experience writing for public consumption, who simply want to set down something honest about someone gone. It said Eli had been 8 years old. It said he had loved comic books and peanut butter sandwiches and a particular television show about a boy who built robots. It said he was survived by his mother, Deborah Brenton, and an older sister, age 12. It said a graveside service would be held, and that in lieu of flowers, the family requested prayers. The Light for Our Children Foundation was not mentioned. Serena Voss was not mentioned. What was also not mentioned was that 10 months after Eli Brenton went into the ground in a cemetery 40 minutes south of Cincinnati, his face was still posted on a donation page, still collecting money for care he had no use for anymore. I came away from the table on legs that weren't steady, and it had nothing to do with stiffness from sitting. Both hands went to the back of the chair and held it. I stood that way with my eyes closed longer than I meant to, breathing through my nose in the slow, deliberate way a man breathes, when keeping himself composed is a task that requires real effort. Eli, 8 years old, comic books and peanut butter sandwiches, and a boy who built robots on television, dead 14 months. Still on the website fighting bravely, still on the website grateful for every dollar, still pulling in donations for a recovery that was never gonna happen because there was no longer anyone there to recover. I pulled on my jacket and laced my shoes and drove to the public library, doors open at 6:30, because I needed a printer and access to records, and I needed walls around me that were not my kitchen walls, where the overhead light had started to feel like something passing judgment. The librarian unlocking the entrance was a woman in her 30s who offered me the measured, impersonal kindness that public employees extend to old men who turn up before the rest of the city has had its coffee. "Can I help you find something?" "A few things," I told her. "I'll ask if I run into trouble." 2 hours at a workstation tucked into the far corner of the reference room. Deborah Brenton appeared in the county property records, a rental listed under her name. Same town the obituary had named. A local church newsletter from the spring before carried a short remembrance of Eli. The kind of notice a small congregation puts together because it believes its losses deserve to be recorded. And inside the archive financial filings from Serena's foundation, a campaign created specifically for Eli Brenton. Start date March 2022. Status as of the most recent filing active. Total collected $31,400. Every cent of it received after the date printed on Eli Brenton's death certificate. My throat tightened until it ached. I pressed my mouth shut hard and stared at that figure $31,400 and held in my mind the image of Deborah Brenton in a rented house 40 minutes south of Cincinnati, living her life with no knowledge that her dead child's face was being used to extract money from strangers. I printed everything: the obituary, the church newsletter, the archived campaign page, the financial filing, 2 sets of each divided into separate folders. One folder I labeled in capital letters, with the black marker I carry in my jacket pocket, for the moments when something needs to be made permanent and clear. Eli. I drove back with the folders riding on the passenger seat beside me. In the driveway, I left the engine idling well past the point where I had any reason to staring through the windshield, at nothing, letting the heat run, because April had gone cold again the way it does when it hasn't finished making its point. "You built this," I said, out loud. To no one in particular, and to Caden, and to Serena, and to whatever remained of the boy I had once fed and driven to baseball practice and sat beside at a kitchen table doing homework 25 years ago. "You built this out of dead children." My voice gave out on the last word. Just slightly, barely enough to register, but I registered it. I killed the engine, gathered the folders, walked inside. 31 years in this work had taught me one thing above most others: the moment your hands begin to shake is the moment you stop seeing clearly. So, I kept them still. I slid the folders into the filing cabinet alongside Dr. Boyd Whitaker's report, the USB drive in its fireproof box, the photographs of the medicine bottles, and I thought about Caden, my son, who held a law degree and carried my name, and had apparently chosen to build his career on precisely the category of crime I had spent 31 years putting people away for. I needed to know how deep he was in it. That question had to come before anything else. There is a particular kind of intelligence that never draws attention to itself. Caden had always possessed it, that capacity to appear engaged in one thing, while quietly doing another, to construct something layered and deliberate behind a face that projected nothing more than ordinary competence. I had watched him work this way his entire life, in small domestic moments, in the careful architecture of family conversations, where he always arrived at the outcome he wanted, without anyone quite tracking how he got there. For a long time, I had filed this away as the habit of an ambitious man learning to move through the world. I understood now that I had been watching him train. The Ohio Secretary of State maintains a public database of every business entity and non-profit organization registered in the state. No subpoena required, no badge, no authority, no credentials of any kind. All you need is a computer, a search field, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing the truth in cases like this is almost always right there in the open, sitting inside a document that was always meant to be seen. I found the Articles of Incorporation for the Light for Our Children Foundation on a Tuesday afternoon, filed in the spring 3 years back. The registered agent was Serena Voss, the stated purpose: support for children living with chronic and terminal illness. 14 pages of dense, load-bearing legal language, the kind drafted to accomplish a specific task with precision. The attorney of record was Caden Mercer. His signature sat on page 11, just above the certification line in the confident, slightly forward-leaning script he had carried since college. I had seen that same signature on birthday cards, holiday checks, once on a get-well note he had sent me after my knee surgery 6 years ago. I recognized it the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you've shared years with. I printed the page. Then I called Clive Dunmore, a retired attorney I had worked alongside during a nonprofit fraud case in 2008. A man with the rare gift of reading legal documents the way other people read novels, fast and with total retention. "Clive," I said. When he picked up, "I'm going to walk you through a document structure, and I need you to tell me what it was built to do." "Hello to you too," Harlan Clive said. But he was already settling in. I could hear it in his voice, that focusing of attention a man gets when someone hands him the kind of problem he secretly misses. "Go ahead." I took him through what I had found buried across 3 years of Caden's filings, the foundation sitting at the top, 2 subsidiary accounts beneath it, and a fiscal sponsorship arrangement with a third-party administrator that processed the bulk of incoming donations before cycling them back through the foundation's operating account. Clive listened all the way through without cutting in, which was not his habit. When I finished, the silence ran a beat longer than usual. "Harlan," he said, and his voice had shifted into the register he saved for things that actually alarmed him. "Whoever put this together knew precisely what they were doing. This is not sloppiness, and it is not improvisation. This structure was designed from the ground up to make money movement read as program expenditure. The fiscal sponsorship layer is doing the heavy lifting. It puts enough distance between the donation and where it lands that a routine audit would have a very difficult time tracing the path." "Could someone have assembled this without knowing what it would be used for?" I asked. Clive made a sound not quite a laugh, but close. "No. You don't build this kind of architecture by accident, and you don't draw these plans without understanding what they're meant to hold. Whoever wrote this knew the end product going in." A pause. "Is it your son?" I looked at the printed page on the desk. At Caden's signature on line 11. "Yes," I said. Clive breathed out slowly. "I'm sorry, Harlan." "Don't be," I said. "Not yet. I'm not finished." I thanked him and hung up and sat looking at that page for a long time without touching it, just taking in the fact of Caden's name at the bottom of a document that had been used across 3 years to drain hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who believed they were helping sick children. The filing date was stamped in the upper right corner of page 1. I had clocked it when I first opened the document, but had not let myself really look at it until now. The foundation was incorporated in March 3 years ago. Owen had been placed in a wheelchair and presented to the public as a gravely ill child 4 months after that in July of that same year. Caden had not been pulled into his wife's operation after it was already moving. He had drafted the blueprints 3 months before the first child was ever put in front of a camera. My son had not been drawn into this. He had engineered it. I was sitting with that feeling, it pressed into my chest, like something with real mass when my phone rang. Caden. I watched his name on the screen through 2 full rings. Then I picked up, "Dad." His voice was relaxed, almost warm, the tone he reached for when charm was the most efficient instrument available. "Just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a few days." "I've been keeping busy," I said. "You know how it is?" "Sure." A pause, short half a second, but I caught it the way you catch a drop note in a song you know by heart. "You doing okay? Getting out of the house?" "Went to the library yesterday," I said. "Returned some books." "Good, good." Another pause, a beat longer than the first. "Owen asked about you, by the way. Wants to know if you'll come for dinner again soon." "Tell him I'll be in touch," I said. "Will do." His voice hadn't shifted still. Easy, still warm, still the practiced performance of a son keeping an eye on his aging father. But the rhythm of it felt managed in a way that made the back of my neck go cold. "Take care of yourself, Dad." "Always do," I said. He hung up. I set the phone face down on the desk, both palms flat against the surface. I could feel my own heart beat harder than I wanted it. Not fear, something more specific than fear. The gut-level recognition that the person across the board already understands the shape of what's being played. Caden was not calling out of concern. He was calling to take inventory, which meant the time I had left to finish building my case was considerably shorter than I had been counting on. I pulled my files closer and picked up the pace. I had been careful in the way the work had trained me to be careful methodically. No shortcuts, checking everything twice, because the difference between a case that stands and one that falls apart is almost always a single detail someone decided wasn't worth verifying. Physical copies in a fireproof box. Digital copies on a drive that had never touched a network. The full picture withheld from everyone, even Clive, even Dr. Boyd Whitaker. No single person held more than a portion of what I knew, and it had not been enough. I learned that on a Thursday morning in early May, the kind of morning that offers nothing in the way of weather, flat gray sky, no wind, the season still undecided. I had slept more soundly than usual, which in retrospect I should have read as a warning. I have come to understand over many decades that the mornings when I wake up feeling composed are frequently the ones with something waiting at the other end. I made coffee in the kitchen and carried it through to my office. What I was about to discover that night would confirm everything I had feared and reveal just how far the people closest to me were willing to go. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you suspected someone inside your own family was working against a child you loved, would you confront them directly, or would you build your case in silence first? The fireproof box beneath the desk was shut-locked exactly as I had left it. I used the small key I kept on my person at all times, turned it, lifted the lid, and reached into the left rear corner for the USB drive. I always kept wedged behind the blue folder holding Dr. Boyd Whitaker's report. My fingers closed around the folder. They found nothing else. I pulled the folder out and set it on the desk. I looked into the box, tilted it toward the window light. The drive was gone. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury available to people who have never learned what it costs. What I did instead was set my coffee cup down with great care on the corner of the desk and begin working through every location where I kept backup materials methodically, one after the next. The secondary drive from the false bottom of the filing cabinet drawer, gone. The printed copies of the Form 990 discrepancies and Wendell's findings, gone. The photographs of the medicine bottles from Caden's bathroom cabinet. I opened my phone, hands completely steady jaw, tight enough that it ached. Those were still in my camera roll. Whoever had come through here had taken the physical materials and cleared the laptop folder, but had either missed my phone or couldn't reach it. I settled into my desk chair and looked at the room with the particular clarity of a man taking stock of damage. The fireproof box showed no sign of force. The lock had been turned with a key not defeated. The filing cabinet drawer sat fully closed the way I always left it, which meant whoever had done this knew exactly where to look and how to move through the space without leaving it looking disturbed. Caden held a key to my house. I had given it to him 4 years ago, not long after Lorraine died, because he had asked for it, and I had taken that as the kind of thing a son does when he's concerned about his father living alone. I had never asked for it back. It had not once crossed my mind to ask for it back. My coffee had gone cold. I wrapped both hands around the mug, regardless needing something solid to hold on to. All right, I said aloud to the empty room to myself, to the version of this I had anticipated and the version I hadn't. All right. I picked up my phone and called my attorney, a man named Arden Fielding, who handled estate matters primarily, but had the sharpness to recognize when a situation had migrated into different terrain. He picked up on the second ring. Arden, I said I need 30 minutes of your time today if that's possible. I have 11 o'clock, he said. Everything all right, Harlan? Someone came into my home without authorization and removed documents, I said. I need to understand what my options are. A short pause. Arden was not a man given to drama, which was precisely why I had chosen him years ago. I'll hold 11, he said. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat in my office with the empty fireproof box on the desk in front of me and my phone in my hand, and I did the one thing every instinct I had ever developed told me never to do when things were falling apart. I let myself feel it just for a minute, only as long as it took to understand what I was truly up against. Because the plain fact was that I was 69 years old, sitting alone in a house where the box that used to hold my evidence was now empty. And the person who had emptied it was my son. And I was tired, not broken, not beaten, but tired in the way that goes all the way to the bone. The exhaustion of a man who had given his entire working life to shielding children from exactly this species of predator, and had somehow arrived at retirement shielding his own grandson from his own child. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my wrist against them hard and held it there until they stopped. You don't get to win this, I said, quietly aimed at Caden's absence at the empty room. My voice came out rougher than I intended, torn at the edges in a way I hadn't heard from myself in years. Not this one. I put the box back where it belonged and locked it out of pure habit, even with nothing inside worth protecting. Then I sat very still and took account of what remained. The photographs on my phone. Dr. Boyd Whitaker's sealed report still in its blue folder, left behind maybe because it was tucked inside the box and went unnoticed, maybe because a sealed medical document is harder to make disappear than a thumb drive. And something else. Something I hadn't counted yet because I hadn't thought to count it. The answer came from a direction I never would have anticipated. It came from a 10-year-old boy and a handheld game console I had given him 2 Christmases ago. I called Caden that afternoon and asked whether I could take Owen to the park. He said yes, sounding almost magnanimous about it, carrying that particular brand of ease that belongs to a man who believes the contest is already over and can afford small gestures of generosity. I had heard that tone before in other rooms from other people who had made the mistake of counting what they'd won before the final hand was laid down. Of course, Dad, he said. Fresh air is good for him. Just don't keep him out too long. I'll have him back by 5, I said. I picked Owen up at 2:30. He was waiting on the front steps, jacket-zipped wheelchair folded beside him. He got himself into the back seat and we drove to Alt Park, a small stretch of green, about 8 minutes from Caden's house, near enough to feel familiar, far enough that no one from the house could hear us talk. We found a bench near the far end, well clear of the playground, where a handful of younger children were running themselves out in the late afternoon. April had finally stopped pretending it was still winter. The trees along the path were doing what trees do in May, going from bare to suddenly almost embarrassingly full, as though they had been holding their breath and had finally been given leave to exhale. Owen sat beside me and stared out at the path for a time, his sneakers pressing rhythmically into the gravel in the restless, unfocused way of a child who has something to say and is still deciding how to begin. "Grandpa," he said at last, "are you in trouble?" His voice was measured not the offhand question of a child, but the careful phrasing of someone who had been listening to adult conversations through closed doors, and had arrived at the age where asking directly felt like the right move. "What makes you ask that, buddy?" I said. "Dad's been different," he said, picking at the cuff of his jacket. "Ever since last week, he and Mom keep talking after I'm supposed to be asleep. I heard your name a lot." He looked up at me, and his eyes were older than they had any right to be. They sounded angry. I looked at my grandson, this 10-year-old boy who had been carrying things no child ought to carry, who had learned to read the temperature of adult rooms the way other kids his age were learning to read chapter books. Something moved through my chest, grief and fury in equal measure, and underneath both of them, a love so absolute it made my hands press hard against my knees. "I'm working through some things," I told him, "but I'm all right. You sure?" "I'm sure." I held his eyes. "Are you okay?" He considered that, really considered it, which told me more than any answer would have. Children who were genuinely fine don't need to think about it. I kept something he said. "I've been holding on to it for a while." He paused. I wasn't sure I should say anything. Then he reached into the front pocket of his jacket and produced a small USB drive no bigger than his thumb, attached to the keychain of the handheld game console I had given him 2 Christmases ago. The console hung beside it, red shell one corner, slightly scuffed from a fall it had taken at some point. "I put things on here," he said, "on the drive, things from Mom's laptop. She always left a USB port open on the side." My heart stopped. Then it restarted louder than before. "When did you do this?" I asked, and I was grateful for how level my voice came out, because nothing inside me was level at all. "A few months ago," he said. He turned the console over slowly in his hands. "I saw the folder on her computer once when she left the screen open, the one she always said not to touch." He stared down at the scuffed corner of the console. I knew what was in those videos. I was in them. His voice went thin and tight. I thought, if she deleted everything, then nobody would ever know it wasn't real. And I wanted someone to know. I just didn't know who to give it to yet. I reached out and covered both his hands with mine, the console, his fingers, all of it, and held on. "Owen." My voice came out rougher than I had intended, scraped at the edges in a way I had not planned for. "You did the right thing. Do you hear me?" He nodded. His jaw was working in that way. A child's jaw works when they are fighting hard not to cry in front of someone and starting to lose. "I was scared," he said. "I'm still scared. I know," I said, and I tightened my grip on his hands. Being scared and doing the right thing regardless. That's the only kind of courage that means anything. He broke then. Not dramatically, not in any way that drew attention. It was quieter than that, more interior. The crying of a child who has been holding something so long that the act of releasing it is almost harder than the weight of carrying it had been. His shoulders shook. He turned his face toward me and pressed it into my jacket sleeve, and I wrapped my arm around him and held him in a way I hadn't held him since he was small enough to lift entirely off the ground. "You're not in trouble." I told him, my voice low and steady, and meant for no other ears on earth. "None of this belongs to you. Not one piece of it." He cried for a few minutes and then slowly wound down the way weather winds down, not all at once but in stages, the worst of it easing off, until there was only the occasional catch of breath and the wet shine on his face when he finally straightened and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Sorry," he said. "Don't you dare apologize for that," I said. He almost laughed. Almost. I took the drive from him carefully and turned it in my hand and confirmed what was on it. 17 video files copied imperfectly, some of them partial, but enough. My hands were not shaking. I would not let them shake until I was somewhere by myself. "Can I hold on to this for now?" I asked. Yeah, he nodded. I saved it for you. I just didn't know how to bring it up. I drove him home an hour later. He sat in the back seat with his head tipped against the glass, not asleep, but not talking either. The particular stillness of a child who has set something down and is still getting used to what his own hands feel like without it. I did not yet know that by the time I pulled into my driveway that night, Caden had already made his opening move. The papers arrived at 7 in the morning. I had been awake since 5. I am always awake since 5, a habit forged across 30 years of working hours that had no patience for sleeping in. I was on my second cup of coffee when I heard a car pull up outside. Not my driveway, the street. The particular idling sound of a vehicle that has reached its destination and is in no hurry to announce it. I went to the front window. A gray sedan sat at the curb, 2 men inside. After roughly 90 seconds, the passenger door opened and a man in a dark jacket came up my front path and knocked with the brisk, businesslike rap of someone who had done this many times and had no feelings about it either way. I opened the door. "Harlan Mercer," he said. "That's me," I said. He held out a manila envelope. "You've been served," he said, and turned and walked back to the car. That was the full extent of our acquaintance. I closed the door, carried the envelope to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened it with the letter opener Lorraine had kept in the drawer by the sink for 40 years, the one with the green handle that had faded to a dull olive from so much use. The filing ran 22 pages. Caden had used a firm I didn't recognize, not his own, which told me he had been deliberate enough to put professional distance between himself and this particular document. Smart. Controlled. Exactly what I would have expected from the man who had engineered a 3-layer financial structure to conceal charitable fraud. The claims were precise, and I will admit genuinely clever. Interference with parental rights grounded in my taking Owen to an unauthorized medical appointment without written consent from both parents, despite the fact that Serena had agreed to it verbally. Misappropriation of charitable assets built on the USB drive I had copied from Serena's laptop, which the filing characterized as theft of proprietary organizational materials. Unauthorized access to protected health information drawn from the photographs I had taken of the medicine bottles in Caden's bathroom cabinet. Every charge was anchored in something that had actually happened. Every charge was framed so that the truth read like the offense. I read all 22 pages. Then I called Arden Fielding. "Arden," I said when he picked up, "I need you to read something today. It's going to make you uncomfortable." "How uncomfortable?" he said. 22 pages uncomfortable, I said. "I'll scan it and send it over in the next 10 minutes. He was quiet a moment. "Harlan, how serious is this?" "It's built to look very serious," I said. "Whether it actually is depends on what I have left to work with." "And what do you have left?" I thought about the handheld game console locked in my fireproof box, Dr. Boyd Whitaker's sealed report in its blue folder, the photographs still on my phone. "Enough," I said. "Possibly." I sent him the scan. He called back 40 minutes later, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man who has read something troubling and is doing his best to present it as manageable. "The parental rights claim is the most serious," Arden said. "Technically, taking the child to a medical facility without written consent from both parents, regardless of verbal agreement, creates real exposure. The asset misappropriation angle is weaker. Whether what you took constitutes proprietary materials is genuinely arguable. The health information charge is the thinnest of the 3. But Harlan," he paused, taken together, "they construct a narrative. And right now, you don't have a counter-narrative I can put in front of a judge." "Not yet," I said. "I need you to be careful," Arden said, his voice dropping from professional to personal. "These are serious people with resources behind them. If they push for a temporary restraining order, limiting your contact with the boy, they will," I said. "Then we need to move fast." "I know," I said. "Give me a few days." I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table with the 22-page filing in front of me and switched on the small television I keep on the counter for the morning news, mostly from habit, and I was reaching to turn it back off when I heard Serena's voice. I left the remote where it was. She was on the local news channel 7, a mid-morning segment, sitting in a chair angled to catch soft light from a window, wearing a dark blouse and no jewelry whatsoever, which was a deliberate calculation because jewelry reads as prosperous and she needed to read as wounded. Her eyes were rimmed red. Her hands sat folded in her lap, with the careful tension of a woman working very hard to appear as though she was barely keeping herself together. "My father-in-law has been harassing our family for months," she said, her voice fracturing at exactly the right instant. The fracture so precisely placed it would have been impressive in any other context. He has stolen private medical records. He has taken our son without our knowledge. He has interfered with Owen's treatment at the worst possible time. She pressed her lips together. Her chin trembled. We are terrified. We are just trying to protect our child, and we don't understand why he is doing this to us. The anchor, a woman in her 40s with the practiced sympathetic expression of someone whose job requires her to appear genuinely moved, leaned forward slightly. And how is Owen doing through all of this? Serena's face collapsed. She brought one hand up and covered her mouth, held it there for a moment. He's scared, she said through her fingers. He's sick and he's scared, and he just wants his family to be okay. The segment cut to a photograph of Owen, not a recent one pulled from the Foundation's website. The hospital gown, the pallid face, those eyes angled just past the camera lens. I clicked the television off. I sat alone in my quiet kitchen and let the full weight of it settle over me. Not just the legal filing, not just the broadcast, but both of them together, a deliberate 1-2 construction of a public story, built to hollow out my credibility before I could say a single word in my own defense. By the close of business that day, I understood that clip would be circulating several hundred times over. By the following morning, people who had never laid eyes on me would have formed firm opinions about the kind of man I was. My neighbor across the street, Dolores Kimball, who I had known for 11 years and who showed up at my door with a pie every Thanksgiving without exception, would watch that segment and come away with a discomfort about me she wouldn't quite be able to name. That unease would be sitting right there in her expression the next time we crossed paths and I would have to meet it. 40 minutes later, a headline came through on my phone pushed by a local news aggregator I'd signed up for years ago and never gotten around to canceling. Grieving family says grandfather stole funds meant for sick grandson. I read it 3 times. Then I laid the phone face down on the table. I walked to the kitchen and brewed a fresh cup of coffee because the old one had gone cold while I was working through a filing engineered to undo everything I had spent 2 months assembling. And because I had been in situations before where the story being told about me bore no resemblance to the true one, and I had learned that the worst thing you can do in that moment is move before you're ready. There was one final piece I needed to set in place, and I was nearly there. What I'm about to tell you did not happen last week or last month. It happened before the garden, before the rubber ball, before I ever sat in that backyard on a Saturday morning in March and watched my grandson's foot tap against the footrest of a wheelchair. It happened in February, the 6 months before any of that. I'm telling you now because you need to understand that nothing I did was improvised. None of it was reaction. It happened in February before the garden, before the rubber ball, before Owen's 7 words on a Saturday morning cracked open something in me I had been keeping carefully sealed for 4 years of retirement. It happened because of a phone call I made on a Tuesday night in the 2nd week of February, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I'd made in place of coffee because it was late and I was trying to get to sleep at a decent hour for once. And because something had been lodged at the back of my mind for 3 months, that I had been calling a feeling and was now prepared to call a suspicion. I called the Ohio State Judicial Ethics Commission, not as a grandfather, not as a worried family member, but as a man who had spent 31 years building the very processes that commission relied on to do its work, who knew the direct line to the deputy director because he had personally trained the deputy director's predecessor, and who understood, with the particular clarity of a career spent navigating exactly this kind of complexity, that the worst thing you can do when you suspect serious wrongdoing is move too fast and too visibly. The deputy director was a woman named Nadine Corley. She picked up on the 3rd ring, Mr. Mercer, she said, and the formality in her voice told me she had recognized the number before she answered. It's been a while. It has, I said. I need to open a channel, Nadine. Informal to start. Nothing on the record yet. A brief pause. How serious? Serious enough that I'm calling you at 9:30 on a Tuesday instead of waiting until morning, I said. She understood without further explanation. That is the thing about people who have worked in this field long enough. You don't have to spell out the weight of something. They feel it through the line. Tell me what you have, she said. I told her what I suspected, not what I knew. I barely knew anything in February, just the shape of wrongdoing without its specifics, the outline of a crime without the evidence yet to fill it in. I told her about the charity, about the patterns that didn't add up, about a child I believed was being used in ways that cut directly across the integrity of any legal proceedings that might follow. If this goes where I think it's going, I said there will be a court filing. And when there is, I need a parallel investigation already running, not launched after the fact. Running before the first document is ever filed. Nadine was quiet for a moment. You're asking us to open a preemptive inquiry based on a suspicion. I'm asking you to open a channel, I said, based on 31 years of me being right about these things. Another pause longer. Then send me what you have in writing through the secure portal. I'll send it tonight, I said. Harlan, her tone shifted less official, more human. Be careful if you're right about who's involved. I know I said. That's why I'm calling you instead of anyone else. I sent the preliminary memo that night. 4 pages. Careful, measured, everything hedged appropriately, because at that point I was still working from suspicion rather than evidence. But the channel was open, the clock was running, and every piece of evidence I gathered over the months that followed the videos, the medical report, the financial discrepancies, the photographs, everything Owen had saved on his handheld game console went into that channel piece by piece, constructing something that no single dramatic courtroom moment could ever have built on its own. That was the thing Caden had never understood about me. He took my pace for age. He read my caution as fear. He had watched me move deliberately through my retirement and concluded that deliberate was the ceiling of what I was capable of. It had never occurred to him that deliberate was a weapon. Now it was the last week of May, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with a red envelope in front of me. Inside it, formal confirmation from the commission that the parallel investigation was complete. The findings were documented, and the process I had written 31 years ago was poised to be activated at the right moment. One phone call from me would bring it into the open. One document placed on a judicial bench would set in motion a review that no sum of money or legal maneuvering could halt once it began. I picked the envelope up. It was lighter than it had any right to be given everything it held. I slid it into the inside pocket of the jacket I had already set out for the hearing. A dark gray suit, the one I wore to Lorraine's funeral, and hadn't touched since because it seemed fitting to walk into what I hoped would be the last hard day of my life, wearing something that had already endured the worst one. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of June. I had 6 days. 6 days to sit with 31 years of work, one red envelope, and the knowledge that what was about to unfold in that courtroom would either save my grandson or consume whatever good years I had left in the attempt. I was not afraid. I want to say that plainly. Fear belongs to people who haven't thought things through. I had been thinking this through since February. The courthouse smelled the way courthouses always do, recycled air industrial cleaner, and the particular tension of people waiting for other people to make decisions about their lives. I had spent most of my adult life in courtrooms, not as a litigant, not until this year. I had never before been the one seated at the respondent's table, but I had come as an advisor, an observer, an expert called in to testify or consult, or simply sit in the back and take stock of how a proceeding was being managed. I understood how these rooms functioned. I knew their grammar, their rhythms, the particular way silence moves differently in a space with high ceilings and wood paneling, the official weight of the law pressing down from every surface. What I had never carried before was the distinct feeling of walking into one of those rooms as the person whose life was being decided. I arrived 20 minutes early. My attorney Arden Fielding was already at the respondent's table when I entered, briefcase open, reading glasses on, working through papers with the focused energy of a man who had done his homework and was running through it once more just to be certain. He looked up when I took my seat and gave me the kind of nod that says, "I've done everything in my power, and the rest belongs to the day." "How are you?" he asked. "Ready?" I said. Because I was. Caden and Serena walked in 8 minutes after I did, flanked by their legal team, a pair of downtown attorneys who moved with the rehearsed confidence of people accustomed to billing $400 an hour. Caden had on a navy suit I'd never seen before. There was no tension in him, no uncertainty. He carried himself the way a man does when he's already decided the day is a formality, the verdict a foregone conclusion. His eyes never found mine as he settled into his chair. He smoothed his jacket, flipped open his folder, then angled toward his lead attorney and said something quiet that drew a single sharp nod. Serena took the seat to his right in a charcoal dress, both hands resting together on the table's surface, gaze tilted slightly downward, the studied posture of a woman staging grief for a room full of strangers. Once she let her eyes drift over to me. The look wasn't quite contempt, wasn't quite victory, but it occupied the territory between them. Then she looked away. The gallery behind the bar was modest. 6 people total, Two of them journalists I recognized from the Channel 7 piece pens already moving across open notebooks. Judge Leonard Tatum came through the door at 9:02, a trim man in his mid-50s, temples gone silver, every movement measured and unhurried in the way of someone who understood that a judge who rushes signals something is wrong. He didn't need to perform the authority he held. It simply lived in him the way gravity lives in heavy things. "Be seated," he said, and the room obeyed. For several minutes he worked through the initial filings without expression, marking the occasional passage with his pen, small notations I had no angle to read. Caden's lead attorney Colburn then rose to open the proceedings. What followed was polished, thoroughly prepared, and constructed around a single narrative: a gravely ill child, a devoted young family, and an aging grandfather, whose morning had soured into something erratic and threatening. Sitting there listening, I had to acknowledge it. The thing was genuinely well built. Colburn had gathered every factual element, the unauthorized medical visit, the USB drive, the photographs, and arranged them so that each one read not as the product of careful inquiry, but as proof of a man unraveling. He delivered the whole thing across 11 minutes at a single controlled register, never raising his voice, which landed harder than any raised voice would have. When he sat down, Judge Tatum turned to the medical file Caden's team had submitted and moved through the top pages with the quick, practiced efficiency of a man who reviewed documents for a living. He put two questions to Colburn about the treatment timeline. Colburn handled both without pausing. Tatum jotted something down. Then his hand moved toward his pen with the slow, settled purpose of a man about to put his signature on something. My jaw went tight. Next to me, Arden made a small shift in his seat. The judge hadn't once asked to see the underlying medical records, the originals. He hadn't called for any independent confirmation of what had been handed to him. He was on the verge of signing a temporary order, handing Owen back to his parents' full custody, relying entirely on documents that Caden's team had assembled. Documents I knew with no doubt at all bore no accurate resemblance to the child I'd brought to Dr. Boyd Whitaker's office back in March. Arden leaned, close voice barely audible. "Harlan, if he signs that—" "He won't," I said. Arden turned to look at me. My hand was already moving to the inside pocket of my jacket. "Your Honor." The words came out exactly the way I needed them to level clear, reaching every corner of the room without the slightest edge of a man who feared what he was setting in motion. "Before that order is signed, I'd ask for 2 minutes. There is something this court needs to have on the record." Judge Tatum lifted his eyes from the page. His pen was still suspended in his hand. Across the aisle, Caden's hand, the one lying flat beside his folder, stopped moving entirely. Tatum regarded me for a moment with the unhurried attention of someone recalibrating what kind of morning this was going to be. He lowered the pen to the bench, not signing, just setting it aside, and said, "Go ahead, Mr. Mercer." I got to my feet and placed the red envelope on the table. The room didn't fall silent the way it does in films, that sudden dramatic drop like a switch thrown. It went quiet the way it does when something enters that no one was expecting and no one yet knows how to categorize. The stillness spread from the front outward toward the gallery, row by row, until the only sounds that remained were the overhead ventilation and the soft, steady rhythm of the court reporter's keys. The envelope itself was letter-sized, sealed with the standard adhesive closure of an official government document. No wax, no tape, nothing theatrical. Just the clean institutional finish of something that had moved through proper channels. To look at it was entirely ordinary, a red rectangle on a wooden surface in a county courthouse. Tatum examined it a moment with the careful, blank attention of a man disciplined enough to hold his reaction until he understood what he was reacting to. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "tell me what I'm looking at." I kept both hands flat on the table, spine straight, voice held at the same even pitch I'd once used to brief entire rooms of people who needed information delivered without alarm. "Your Honor, what you're looking at is a formal procedural notification, not evidence. A notification. It confirms that I am activating a review process under the jurisdiction of the Ohio State Judicial Ethics Commission, a process I helped design 31 years ago when I served as special advisor to this court." The stillness acquired weight. Colburn was up before I'd reached the end of the sentence, his chair barking back across the floor. "Objection, Your Honor. This is nothing but a stall. Mr. Mercer has no authority to introduce. It's a notification, counselor," I said, meeting Colburn's eyes for the first time that morning. "Not an exhibit. No authorization is required to present it." The only obligation is that the court be informed of it, which is precisely what I'm doing." Colburn's jaw locked. His eyes went to Tatum. Tatum raised a hand. Nothing theatrical, just the flat practice signal of a judge who needed space to think and saw no reason to make a show of it. "Mr. Mercer, you said you helped to design this process?" "I did, Your Honor, in 1993. It's been revised twice. I was consulted on both occasions." From across the aisle came the sound of Serena, pulling in a breath, sharp barely there, but in that kind of silence perfectly audible. I didn't turn toward her. My eyes stayed on Tatum. "Practically speaking," the judge said, "what does triggering this process actually mean?" "It means," I said, "that a formal independent inquiry by the Commission, specifically into documentation, placed before this court in connection with this case is already underway. It runs alongside these proceedings, not beneath them. Neither party in this room has the power to halt it, and every word spoken here today will become part of the record that inquiry examines." Arden cleared his throat beside me with deliberate care. "Your Honor, in light of the seriousness of this notification, I'd formally ask that everything said and done in this courtroom this morning be captured verbatim in the official transcript." Tatum looked at him. "That is standard procedure, Counselor." "Of course, Your Honor," Arden said, and there was something threading through his voice. Not smugness, Arden was too disciplined for smugness, but a quiet, contained satisfaction he couldn't entirely suppress. I wanted it on the record that we'd asked. The court reporter's fingers hadn't slowed, every word going down, time-stamped, permanent. Caden bent toward Colburn, voice low and clipped. Colburn's reply was short, the reply of a man reconfiguring on the fly, realizing that the morning he'd walked into was not the one he'd been briefed on. Caden's hand pressed into the table surface, fingers spreading, knuckles going pale at their edges. A tremor passed across the corner of Serena's mouth, small, quick caught, and suppressed. But there, the grief she had dressed and positioned so carefully was being called on to carry more than she had built it for. "Your Honor," I said and held until Tatum's attention returned to me. "I would also ask the court to require independent verification of the medical documentation the petitioner has submitted, specifically the original pediatric health records for Owen Mercer. Not the copies presented here this morning, the originals pulled directly from the treating physicians identified within those records." Tatum held my gaze. "You're suggesting what was submitted may not be accurate. I'm suggesting the court is owed certainty," I said. "And so is Owen." Something moved behind Tatum's eyes. Not alarm, not yet, but the quiet internal shift of a careful man who has registered that the foundation beneath this proceeding may not be as solid as it appeared when he first sat down. He placed his pen back on the bench. The signing order was still beneath it, still unsigned. "I'm going to call a brief recess," he said, voice level and unhurried, "to consider the procedural implications of this notification." Colburn was on his feet in an instant. "Your Honor, a recess is unnecessary and prejudicial to our—" "It is my courtroom, Mr. Colburn," Tatum said, quiet, immovable, the tone of a man who never needed volume to end a conversation, "and I will manage it accordingly." He rose. The bailiff moved. The room reorganized itself around the fact that the morning had lurched off the track Caden's side had laid for it. For the first time since he'd sat down, Caden turned and looked at me directly. His eyes were sharp, cold, and furious, and underneath the fury, something else. Something that hadn't been in his face when he'd come through that door with his polished team and his $31,000 charity scandal and his carefully built case. Doubt. I held his gaze and said nothing. I thought about a boy I had raised and the man standing before me now, and the 31 years threading between those two things, years during which I had apparently been far less legible to him than he believed. "I think," Arden murmured from the seat beside me, "that went about as well as we could have asked for." I tugged the cuffs of my jacket straight, Lorraine's funeral jacket, the one that had already endured the worst day I had known, and said, "It isn't over yet," because it wasn't. Not by a long stretch. The recess ran 14 minutes. I know, because I tracked it not out of nerves. I'm well past the age when nerves drive the counting, but with the focused attention of a man who understood that 14 minutes was either sufficient for Tatum to work through the notification and grasp its full weight, or sufficient for Colburn to get on his phone and make the kind of calls that could complicate the next hour considerably. When the bailiff announced that court was resuming, I squared my shoulders, set both palms flat on the table, and fixed my eyes on the door behind the bench. Tatum returned the way he had departed, unhurried, controlled his expression, giving away nothing he hadn't chosen to give. He settled into his seat, opened the folder in front of him, and reached for his pen. Not, I noticed, to sign the order, but to make a notation when the other door opened. Not the main entrance at the back of the gallery, the side door, the one set into the wall to the left of the bench. The door that connects the courtroom to the judge's private corridor. The passage running behind the formal public spaces of a courthouse that is used, in my experience, almost exclusively by judicial officers who need to move between rooms without passing through public areas. That door almost never opens during an active hearing. Every head in the room turned. Chief Justice Irene Beauchamp stepped through it. She was 63 years old, silver-haired, carrying herself with the bearing of a woman who had spent 4 decades in rooms where posture alone communicated authority. Before a single syllable was spoken. She was not in robes. She wore a charcoal suit, severe, immaculate, with a small pin on her lapel. I recognized immediately as the seal of the Ohio Supreme Court. She carried one folder, thin dark blue. She didn't rush her steps. She didn't sweep the room with her eyes the way people do when they're entering unfamiliar territory. She moved through that courtroom as though her right to occupy it predated the construction of the building. Judge Tatum got to his feet. Pure reflex, the instinctive deference of a man whose entire career had existed within a hierarchy that had just walked through his door. "Please be seated, Judge Tatum," Beauchamp said. Her voice was even unhurried, the voice of a woman who had never once needed to raise it to hold a room. "I apologize for the interruption. I'll be brief." She took in the room, the gallery, the journalists in the back row, with their pens stilled over open notebooks. Colburn, who had come halfway out of his chair, and appeared to be calculating whether sitting back down or staying upright was the less damaging choice. She looked at Caden, whose face had done something I had not seen it do in 39 years of knowing him gone completely, utterly blank. The expression of a man whose entire framework has just collided with something it had no category for. Then her eyes came to me, and in them was the particular quality of recognition that belongs to people who have done 22 years of difficult work alongside each other, work you don't bring up at dinner parties. What lived there wasn't surprise, and it wasn't pity, and it wasn't quite warmth either. It was the acknowledgement of 2 people who understood, without having to say a word, what this moment had taken to reach. "My name is Irene Beauchamp," she said to the room, to Tatum, to the court reporter, whose fingers had resumed their movement. "I am the Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court. I am here because Mr. Harlan Mercer contacted my office 8 weeks ago regarding an ongoing matter that intersects directly with the proceedings before this court." Caden's chair scraped back. "Your Honor, Chief Justice, this is highly irregular. We've received no notice of—" "It is irregular," Beauchamp said, turning toward Caden with the calm, complete attention of a woman who was not interrupted twice. "Mr. Mercer has a long history of irregular situations. They tend to resolve correctly." She turned back to Tatum. "Judge Tatum, the Judicial Ethics Commission has been conducting a parallel investigation into documentation submitted in connection with this case, as well as into related matters of potential charitable fraud and child endangerment. That investigation is now complete." Tatum, complete as of this morning. She set the dark blue folder on his bench, placed it precisely, squared it with the edge of the wood. "You'll find the commission's full findings inside. I would ask that you review them before taking any further action in this proceeding." She paused. "I would also note for the record that the man seated at the respondent's table served as special advisor to the Ohio Supreme Court for 31 years. He counseled 3 chief justices on matters of child protection, judicial ethics, and charitable fraud. He advised me personally on 14 separate occasions." Another pause, measured and deliberate like everything else about her. "He is not, as has been suggested in recent public reporting, a confused elderly man acting out of grief." Serena rose from her chair. It went back hard, and when her voice came out, it had cracked at the edges, the careful composure finally splitting under pressure she had not built any plan to absorb. He never told anyone. Caden, he never said, Mrs. Mercer." Beauchamp turned to look at her, simply looked, one long, level, entirely untheatrical look, the full weight of a woman who had spent 4 decades watching people try to perform their way out of corners they'd constructed for themselves. "You will have an opportunity to address the court. That opportunity is not right now." Serena sat. Her hands were shaking visibly genuinely, the trembling of a woman whose body had at last caught up to what her mind had been refusing to accept. She pressed them flat against the table and fixed her eyes on the surface, and did not look up. Caden was standing at the end of his table, one hand gripping the back of his chair, staring at his father. I felt the weight of that look land. My son, my blood. The boy I'd driven to baseball practice and walked through calculus and watched cross a law school stage with a pride I'd never quite found the words to say out loud. Looking at me now, across a courtroom, with the expression of a man who has arrived fully and finally at the understanding that the person he had spent years writing off as inconsequential had been the entire time the most consequential person in the room. Beauchamp looked at me one final time and said, "Harlan, I think it's time." I reached forward and opened the red envelope. Judge Tatum opened the folder. The way a man opens something he suspects may fundamentally alter the shape of his morning, deliberately with both hands as though moving too quickly, might disturb something fragile inside it. The first page was the independent medical assessment, 4 opinions from 4 separate pediatric physicians, none of them connected to any facility named in Serena's foundation. Records everyone arriving at the same conclusion through different clinical language. Owen Mercer was a healthy child. No evidence of chronic illness past or present. The records submitted by the petitioner did not correspond to this patient in any medically verifiable way. Tatum read it without expression. Then he looked up. "Mr. Mercer?" He said, "These findings directly contradict the medical documentation submitted by the petitioner." "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "They do." Colburn rose his voice, climbing higher than it had been at any point that morning. "Your Honor, 4 opinions obtained entirely outside of any formal discovery process cannot simply be. These were gathered through the Commission's own independent inquiry," Beauchamp said from her position near the wall, and her voice cut across Colburn's the way a closing door cuts across noise not raised just conclusive. "They carry the full evidentiary weight of that process. Counselor, the procedural authority is laid out on page 3 of the folder." Colburn dropped back into his seat. His jaw moved without producing words. He did not turn to page 3. Tatum advanced to the second section. Nothing shifted in his face, but the hand resting at the folder's edge went motionless in the particular way a man's hand goes motionless when he is applying serious effort to keeping it still. "The video documentation," he said low almost to himself. A description, not an inquiry. 17 files, I said. "Pulled from a storage device that belonged to Owen. The Commission has confirmed authenticity and chain of custody." From the opposite side of the aisle came a sound from Serena, small, involuntary, the sound of something slipping out before she could catch it. Her palm came up to cover her mouth. Over her fingers, her eyes had gone wide and wet with the specific dread of a person watching the structure that held her life together crack apart, piece by piece, from the foundation up. "The boy saved these himself," Tatum said, not asking, stating. He was frightened they'd be erased. He was 10 years old. I said, and scared enough to hide them inside a Christmas gift I'd given him 2 years back. My voice didn't waver. Holding it steady cost me in a way I set aside to be reckoned with, later alone in my own kitchen when the day was done. Not in that room, not yet. Tatum moved to the next page, the pharmaceutical records, the prescription trail, a compound that appeared nowhere in Owen's official treatment history, a drug discovered in a cabinet in my son's house, labeled with my grandson's name, with nothing resembling a legitimate clinical reason for its presence. Caden's attorney moved close and said something sharp and urgent into his ear. Caden answered with a single shake of his head. Small, hard, final. His complexion had the drained ashen look of a man watching something he set in motion roll past the point where it can be recalled, finally grasping that no maneuver on earth stops it now. 23 children. Tatum said when he arrived at the following section, and something in his voice dropped in a way that had nothing to do with how loudly he was speaking, and everything to do with what those 2 words weighed. 23 documented cases, I said. The Commission's view is that the actual number is higher. The gallery broke not in an uproar, not in some cinematic wave, but in the irreversible way of a room whose occupants have just taken in something that rewrites the event they thought they were attending. Tatum's gavel came down once hard and the room steadied. Then he turned to the page concerning Eli Brenton. He took his time with it, more time than he had given anything else. When he finally raised his eyes, his face had undergone a change that ran deeper than judicial composure, something that the discipline of the bench was not quite sufficient to cover. This child died 14 months before this fundraising campaign was closed. Yes, Your Honor, and the foundation went on accepting donations under his name for 10 months following his death. $31,400. What settled over the room then was a different order of silence, not the held-breath quiet of anticipation, but the heavier kind that comes after understanding has fully landed and nobody feels the need to speak into it. Tatum set the page down. His eyes moved to Caden. "Mr. Caden Mercer," he said, "you are listed as attorney of record in the establishment of the Light for Our Children Foundation. Is that correct?" Caden's attorney reached over and gripped his arm. Caden removed it. "Yes," Caden said. The word arrived empty of everything that had accompanied him through the door that morning, the assurance, the command, the quiet certainty of a man who had never once entered a room without expecting to be its most capable occupant. One syllable, chalked dry. "Are the signatures appearing on the incorporation filings and subsequent contractual documents your own signatures?" The silence ran longer than an answer should take. Colburn leaned in. Caden kept his eyes off his attorney. He kept them off Serena. He fixed them somewhere on the surface of the table in front of him, on some unremarkable point in the grain of the wood. I watched my son arrive at the only option the morning had left him. "Yes," he said again. Beauchamp advanced a step. "Your Honor, on the basis of the Commission's findings, I formally move that this hearing be suspended and the matter transferred to the State Attorney General's Office for criminal investigation." "Granted," Tatum said, and 2 court officers materialized at Serena's side. I had not seen them enter, which told me they had been placed there before the hearing opened, which told me Beauchamp had orchestrated the morning's mechanics with a precision I understood, because she had once learned that kind of precision, partly from me. Serena looked at the officers flanking her, and whatever had remained of her self-possession gave out entirely. She started to cry, not the measured, telegenic grief she had produced for a television camera, but something formless and ugly and uncontrolled. The weeping of a woman who has exhausted every version of herself she had prepared and found nothing waiting beneath them. Caden stood at his table alone. He turned toward me. I looked back at my son. My blood, my failure, the weight I'd carried for longer than this case, and I held his gaze with everything I had left to give it. I didn't drop it until he did. As Beauchamp passed behind me, her hand came to rest briefly on my shoulder. "Harlan," she said barely above a murmur, "the Commission thanks you for your service again." I gave one nod. Then Owen came into my mind and I reached for my jacket and I left that courtroom and walked out into a Tuesday morning in June that looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived. The parking lot sat in full sunlight, warm and indifferent to what the building behind me had just contained. I got into my car and didn't turn the key for a while. Not because I was undone, though something in me was, but because decades of walking out of rooms where consequential things had been decided had taught me that the transition from inside to outside calls for a pause, a breath drawn deliberately, a recognition that what just ended has ended and what comes next has not yet begun. Then I put my hand on the wheel and drove home. What followed came the way things of that weight always come, not in a single crash, but item by item, each one settling into place like a bolt finding its thread. The Ohio State Bar suspended Caden's license pending the criminal inquiry. Nobody was surprised. Caden had understood the instant he spoke that second yes in that courtroom, that everything his career had been was contained in that syllable and ended with it. The criminal charges came next: charitable fraud, criminal conspiracy, child endangerment, not concerning Owen alone, but all 23 children. His attorney was gone within 48 hours. The one who came after was noticeably less formidable. Serena was taken into custody 2 days after the hearing. The foundation was dissolved on court order. Investigators followed the trail into 2 additional states where the organization had run operations, and what they uncovered in those places was, if anything, worse. Deborah Brenton Eli's mother was reached by investigators in July. I was not told the specifics of that conversation. What I was told came through a victim's advocate who contacted me. Afterward, Deborah had asked her to find out whether the person responsible for exposing what had happened to Eli wanted to know that she was grateful. I said yes. I wanted to know that. The guardianship order arrived on a Friday at the end of June. Arden Fielding called at 4:15, his voice carrying that brand of quiet professional satisfaction that for him was as close to joy as his manner permitted. "Harlan," he said, "you can go get him." Owen was at the family services office when I arrived, seated with a caseworker, a backpack beside him, his handheld game console in his lap. The red shell. One corner slightly scuffed. The USB drive on its keychain, the same one he'd placed in my hands 2 months earlier. He got to his feet when I came through the door, watching me from the far side of the room with dark, careful eyes that held something working very hard to become hope and not yet trusting that it was permitted to. Then he walked across and wrapped his arms around me. I held my grandson with both hands and felt him shake, not from crying, just the deep, full-body trembling of a child whose body has finally received the signal that it can stop holding itself together. I stayed there until the trembling stopped. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, his voice lost somewhere in my jacket. "I think so." "Good, that's enough for today." Those early weeks, the morning he discovered the hardwood floors in his socks and grinned at me across the kitchen while I stood at the stove asking for eggs loaded with everything on them. Come November, he was enrolled in 5th grade, playing soccer on weekends and issuing firm daily verdicts on the cafeteria, pizza, like a man with standards. I had given 31 years to making certain that the people who held power over children grasped a single principle above all others. A child is not a product, not a prop, not a vehicle for someone else's story. I never once thought my final case would end up sitting at my breakfast table, fork in hand, asking whether I thought he should try out for the soccer team. I told him yes. I meant it with everything I had left. People ask whether I regret the pace, whether I should have moved faster, spoken up sooner, made noise before it ever reached a courtroom on a Tuesday in June. My honest answer is no. I believe God places certain people in certain positions for reasons that only resolve themselves in hindsight. I spent 31 years constructing something I assume was built for strangers. It turned out it was also built for one boy, a small USB drive, and the quiet nerve to save 17 video files on the chance that someone would eventually look. That someone was me, and I nearly wasn't ready. So here's what I want to say plainly to anyone hearing this. Don't follow my example. Don't hold out for perfect evidence or the right moment or every last piece in position. If something feels wrong about a child in your life, a grandchild, the kid next door, a student, anyone, say something. Say it badly. Say it while you're scared. Say it before you're sure. The children who need you have no room to wait for your certainty. Justice for a family doesn't always come in loud. Sometimes it arrives in a still room inside a red envelope in the voice of a 10-year-old, asking how much longer he has to pretend to be sick. I am a revenge dad in the most reluctant sense of that word. I didn't want revenge. I wanted Owen. Everything else was simply what it cost to get there. That is where this story ends and where I suppose I finally got to begin again. Something I want to sit with you in for just a moment before we part. What this took from me, the years, the restraint, the long months of moving carefully, while the people I love most were being harmed, that cost was real. I won't pretend otherwise. But I believe God places the right person in the right position before they ever understand why. I spent 31 years building a set of tools I thought belonged to strangers. Turns out they belong to Owen. For anyone here who is part of the adults, 50+ community that carries these kinds of weights quietly, this family revenge story is for you. The lesson I keep returning to is this patient preparation is not the same as doing nothing. They look identical from the outside. They are not the same thing at all. So here is what I would tell anyone who finds themselves where I was. If a child in your life shows signs that something is wrong, speak up before you are certain. Uncertainty is not a reason to stay quiet. Document everything quietly and early, because the truth needs a chain of custody just as much as evidence does. Do not let someone else's confidence convince you that you are wrong. Composed people can still be lying, and if the system feels slow, learn how it works from the inside, because that knowledge is the difference between hoping for justice and being able to deliver it. I am grateful for every one of you who listened to the end. If this story moved, you share it with someone who might need to hear it. A parent, a grandparent, anyone carrying a quiet worry about a child they love. Leave a thought in the comments. And if you haven't yet, I'd be honored to have you subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories. There will be more. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves and take care of the ones who need you.